I'd like to welcome you to FACT's webinar called The Nutritional Benefits of Pasture-Raised Animals. Our presenter is Collette Lentz. This webinar is hosted by Food Animal Concerns Trust, or FACT. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating the webinar this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. So to begin with just a few introductions, Food Animal Concerns Trust, or FACT, is a national nonprofit organization that is headquartered in Illinois. We promote the safe and humane production of meat, milk, and eggs. I direct FACT's Humane Farming Program, which provides a number of opportunities for livestock and poultry farmers to increase the number of animals that are raised humanely. This webinar is part of our Humane Farming webinar series. So please visit our website to learn more about our farmer services, including our Fund a Farmer grants, our scholarships, our mentorship program, and to register for an upcoming webinar. So this time I am delighted to introduce our presenter, Collette Lentz. Collette recently received an MS degree in Applied Nutrition from Northeastern University. As part of her practicum last year, Collette helped FACT research the scientific literature to better understand how animal management, and animal feed in particular, impacts the nutritional quality of the food produced by those animals, including red meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy products. We are very lucky to have her with us today to share the results of her review and to explain how this all connects to human health. She will be available to answer your questions later on in the webinar. So with that, I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to Collette so that she may begin her presentation. Collette, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Larissa. And I'm really excited to be able to talk today about the nutritional benefits of pasture-raised animals and what I found in my literature search over the past year. So a little bit about the presentation that we'll go over today. So first, I'll start off with a little bit about the introduction of why this is so important to look at the nutritional benefits of pasture-raised animals. I'll also talk a little bit about the background on the differences between ruminants and non-ruminants, a little bit about the definition of pasture-raised label and what that means today. And then really I'll dive more into the desired nutrient content, so what we would like to see in animal-derived foods. And then, of course, the nutritional advantages of pasture-raised versus conventional raised animals and the connection between diet and human health. And so with this presentation, since we have such a diverse audience, all of this information will be presented on, but mostly we'll be focusing on these last two bullet points. And so a little bit about this presentation. So with this today, with the pasture-raised animals and nutrition being tied, it's also really dives into humane farming in the context of the broader good food movement, which is really how Americans are really focused on what they eat and how they eat. And so it really ties with supporting local, organic, and humanely raised family farmed foods. And so this presentation goes over the literature. So it's just really going over the evidence to date. And it looks at the association between humane animal production and human nutrition. And so I conducted a literature review, and most of the studies are very recent, so mainly from 2000 and later. But some of the studies do include a little bit older, from 1984 is the earliest, and then it goes all the way to 2017 from last year. And so the findings from these studies are summarized in this presentation. And I focused on 5 main food animals. So beef cattle, dairy cows, broiler chickens, laying hens, and swine. And so while these 5 animals were really addressed in this presentation, what we can also gather is that these results that I'll be presenting will translate to other animals as well. And that's what the literature has proven to date, but we'll just be focusing on these main 5 animals in this presentation. And then, so the areas that are included in this presentation, so you focus on the nutritional composition differences for animals raised on different feeds. So that's, for instance, 100% grass-fed versus grain-fed beef and dairy. And then also I talk a little bit about organic versus conventional production for these 5 animals. And so, as I mentioned, the information in this presentation is based on the current available literature, and it's just really meant to hopefully inform and empower you with a better understanding of the nutritional benefits of pasture-raised animals. And one thing to know also is that I will like to mention that it's certainly the case that some of the studies I came across, for instance, may have poor experimental designs. These studies were not included in this review. So the studies that are included here are really well-designed studies. And so each slide has numbers on it, which you can see in this slide here. In that first bullet point, you see 1 and 2 listed there. So every slide has references listed. So if you're curious, those references are listed at the very end of this presentation, and you're more than welcome to dive into the studies and the references that I've listed here. So if you're interested, you can dive into more to learn more about the details. And of course, nutrition research is very difficult considering all of the different confounding variables. But as you'll see in this presentation, the evidence is there to point us in the direction that pasture-raised animals are more nutritious. And of course, additional well-designed studies need to be conducted, but the evidence to date is very convincing, and I hope to show you that today. So with that, we'll start diving in. There is some background first on ruminants versus non-ruminants. And so out of the 5 main animals, beef and dairy cows that I looked at specifically are examples of the ruminant animals. So ruminants have a stomach with 4 compartments, in which the largest of the 4 is a rumen. It's called the rumen. And cows are known natural herbivores, so they eat plants. And so the reason I divide the information between ruminants and non-ruminants is because with ruminants, it's a little bit tricky when you look at the studies, because when ruminant animals eat, grass or grain, the microorganisms in the rumen have a large and significant impact on changing the food composition in the rumen. So, for instance, they have a significant impact on changing the types of fatty acids that they eat, and when in the rumen, and then it changes the composition of the actual beef product that a human will consume, for instance. So it's not exactly like if they eat grass that food will go unchanged throughout them, because it does become a little bit changed in the rumen. So for instance, if there's unsaturated fatty acids, which are considered good fats, in the ruminant's diet, that will be converted to mostly saturated fat or monounsaturated fats. So there's a little bit of change in the fat that is being consumed in the rumen. And so I do want to point that out, because it's not just they become what they eat. There is some change. However, a lot of what they eat does go in them and doesn't become changed. So a portion, for instance, of the fats that they eat do not break down in the rumen and end up in the beef or dairy products that we eat or drink. But it is a little bit trickier when you're looking at ruminants, so beef and dairy cattle. So, however, with non-ruminants, so out of the 5 animals that I looked at in this literature review, there were the non-ruminant animals will be broiler chickens, laying hens, and swine. And these non-ruminants, or monogastric animals, have a single or simple stomach with 1 chamber, and they're known natural omnivores, so they eat both plants and animals. And so for these animals, it really is more that whatever they eat is absorbed unchanged in their small intestine before it gets incorporated into their tissue lipids. So for instance, the dietary fat that they consume becomes unchanged when they eat it, and then you essentially eat, or humans essentially eat, exactly what that very same composition that the animal eats. So it's very predictable when you're looking at the studies. So essentially, if the non-ruminant animal is eating a healthier diet, the animal product that we consume will be a healthier product. So overall, pigs and poultry have relatively simple digestive system. And so, for instance, if you're thinking about fat, that in their diet, if they have a healthier fat in their diet, it'll be a healthier fat composition in the animal product that we consume. So it's very, very more predictable with non-ruminants. And so with that, a little bit more about what pasture-raised means, just because we have a very diverse audience. So with the labeling definition, there really is no common government standard to meet pasture-raised claim on a food label, and there is currently no definition for pasture. Essentially, pasture is like the grass and land that the animals are on and are consuming in their diets, but there is no known definition and nor verification through on-farm inspections. So for dairy and eggs, the FDA that regulates for dairy and eggs has no common standard and does not require pasture labeling to be verified. So the claim really isn't meaningful. For meat and poultry, the USDA does require a claim to be approved, and the companies must explain and define the meaning of the claim. One thing to note, though, is it's just not a standard label, and so the companies really can come up with the meaning of the claim, more or less. And so one thing also to mention is that for beef and dairy, pasture-raised does not equal 100% grass-fed. So they can be given supplemental grain in grazing season and winter months. So if you think pasture-raised, you can think that they're outside enjoying grass. The average consumer will think that their grass is potentially 100%, their diet is 100% grass, but that is not true. What really you need to look for is a third-party verified label or a verified grass-fed claim instead. And so if you see on the right side of the screen, there are many third parties, independent third parties that require access to pasture, and then that really give them the animals a lot of pasture in their diet. And many of these parties adhere to higher standards in addition. So for instance, being cage-free, and one of the examples is animal welfare approved seal. But there are many other third parties, and just to quickly mention, Facts has, I have the link here at the bottom of the slide, has some information about guides that can be given, that can be handed out, or you can just review online to help make the most sustainable and humane choices possible at the grocery store, which is very helpful for consumers since there's so many labels out there. This can be a really helpful link to go to or to give to people to help them understand the different labels. So I thought I'd mention that in there. And then also I wanted to mention just briefly, since some of the studies I'll be talking about later in this presentation focused on organic, so not just necessarily pasture-raised animals, but also organic production of animals. And so organic production of meat, dairy, poultry, and eggs, just as a brief background, they are required to have 100% organic feed and access to the outdoors. So as we'll talk about more in detail, because a lot of the animals are given access to the outdoors, even though their diets may not necessarily have that much pasture or grass included, just because they're given the access to outdoors, ultimately the animals do end up having a lot of grass or pasture in their diets. And so it kind of goes well with just including the studies in here as well on organic production, because many of the animals do have quite a bit of grass or pasture in their diet. Of course, there are other requirements for organic certification, which are listed here. But also I wanted to mention that for ruminants specifically, beef and dairy, they do have to have a certain amount of organic pasture for at least 120 days. So for ruminants specifically, they do have a specific amount of pasture in their diet if they're considered organic. And then for non-ruminants, though, it's really just that they need to have year-round access to the outdoors. No real amount of pasture really required or grass in their diet. But because they have access to the outdoors, they naturally have that in the diet. So you'll see some studies also included in here on organic production of animals as well, and not just focused on pasture-raised. So with that, I will also now go into a little bit about some of the nutrition aspects. So it's good to understand what exactly we're looking for, what is considered more nutritious food product. And so what I have here, I really focus on fats a lot in this presentation, and that's because most of the studies that are out there now have a lot to do with fats or the fat-soluble vitamins, which I'll talk about later as well. And so I have here just a little kind of cheat sheet on dietary fats. So here we have quote-unquote bad fats, in-between fats, and good fats. So this is basically just information that you can find online from the dietary guidelines for Americans. So kind of what is the recommended fats to stay away from and the recommended fats to consume in your diet. So if you look at bad fats at the top, so really it's about you want to limit the artificial and industrial produced trans fats, such as partially hydrogenated oils found in margarine and frozen pizza. So artificial fats, trans fats, aren't found in animal products, but what you will find are natural trans fats. So you'll often hear conjugated linoleic acid, CLA, or transvicinic acid, TVA. Those are found in ruminants, so in dairy products and beef in small quantities. But these natural trans fats, as recommended by the dietary guidelines for Americans, they do not need to be eliminated. They are present in such small amounts in the food. These food products provide many other benefits as well. And in fact, we'll talk about a little bit later, some of these natural trans fats, such as CLA, actually can provide health benefits. So natural trans fats are okay. It's the artificial ones, which aren't present in animals, that are recommended to stay away from. In between fats, so these are saturated fatty acids, or SFAs, and these are very, very common in ruminant products, so meat and dairy products especially, but in all animal products really. And from the dietary guidelines, it's generally recommended to limit the intake of these and replace with unsaturated fats, which is shown in green as the good fats. I do have a star around this just because, just to throw this out there, there is a lot of debate about saturated fats today. Some of you may have heard of diets such as ketogenic diet. That's very common today, that has where diets are having much higher amounts of fat, and which includes saturated fats commonly. So just a little asterisk there. There's a lot of discussion about that, but I just wanted to point out that I have saturated fats as an in-between fat because that's what the dietary guidelines kind of mention now, that you should limit the intake today and replace it with good fats. So there are some fats, though, like stearic acid, that have no negative impact that studies have shown, but there are other saturated fats that do have negative health consequences. So there's some potentially okay saturated fats, some that may have more negative health consequences. This is why it's labeled as an in-between fat. And then good fats, mainly you'll think about good fats coming from like vegetables, nuts, seeds, and fish. But as we'll show today, we can have good fats also come from animal products. And there are two types, really. There are monounsaturated fatty acids, or MUFAs, and then polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs. And there are two main types of PUFAs. omega-3 and omega-6. And while both omega-3 and omega-6 are needed in a diet, a lower ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is generally desirable. Today, the ratio has gotten way out of hand, but you really want a lower ratio, and we'll focus on that in the studies as well, which I'll show here in a little bit. So now that we have a little bit about a background about the dietary fats, let's look at what is the actual fat composition in these animal-derived foods today. So it's really good to have that nutritional background so you can kind of understand where we're at today and where we want to go in the future to make them more nutritious. So I have a graph here shown as some of the examples of conventional food-producing animal products. So really, this came from studies that have animal-fed conventional diets, so primarily grain. And what you can see here is that ruminants, so beef and milk products, for instance, have higher saturated fatty acids, SFAs, which, as you recall, are the in-between fats, and also higher amount of monounsaturated fatty acids, so MUFAs, which are good fats. Ruminants also have more natural trans fats, as I mentioned, including conjugated linoleic acid. And then products from non-ruminants, so chicken meat, eggs, and pork, have a higher amount of the polyunsaturated fats, or PUFAs. So they already naturally have a higher amount of good fats. And so what I have in this graph is kind of the goal of what you would want to do. So under conventional, for instance, dairy products have a higher amount of saturated fatty acids. So to meet those dietary guidelines that we talked about on the previous slide, you would want to, for instance, minimize your saturated fat content and then also increasing your amount of monounsaturated, or MUFA, and you want to increase your PUFA, your polyunsaturated. So that's kind of the goal of what you would want to do to make them more nutritious, to meet the dietary guidelines. Of course, these trends that I show in this graph differ depending on the animal's genetics, gender, age, type of meat, breed, the management practices, geographical location, and of course the feedstuffs that we're talking about today. So there are many, this is just a graph that shows an example. So these values can vary significantly, but this is just to give you an idea of the average amount and where we would want to go to help make them more nutritious. And to continue, this slide is a continuation of the previous one, and so this we're just looking at specifically the omega-3, which is a specific type of PUFA, a good fat, and what you can see is we would want to increase the omega-3 content to make them more nutritious. And then on the graph, that's the left graph, and then on the graph on the right, we really want to reduce the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So you can do that by either decreasing the amount of omega-6 or increasing the amount of omega-3 to make that ratio more, to go in the right direction to decrease the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So these slides, this one and the previous one, really show you where you want to go in terms of fat composition of these animal-derived foods. And in addition to fat, of course, their animal food products are a good source of many other nutrients, such as vitamins like vitamin E and D, minerals such as iron, and other important nutrients, including antioxidants, carotenoids, and polyphenols. And also, there are some natural trans fats that have been shown to have some health benefits as well. So this is just a general recommendation of, okay, if we have these animal-derived food products, which nutrients do we want to increase and which ones do we want to decrease in these products? So, and this is true not just for animal products, this is true for anything that you have really in your diet. So if you look on the left, it says these are the things we want to increase. We want to increase those healthy fats, PUFAs and MUFAs, especially omega-3 content. We want to increase vitamin content, of course, such as vitamin E and D. We want to increase minerals, such as iron. And we want to increase some of the other important nutrients, such as antioxidants, carotenoids, and polyphenols. And then we want to decrease the following on the right side. We want to lower the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, replace saturated fats with healthier good fats. Again, these are just the dietary guidelines, recommendations. And also, some may want to decrease total fat. I included this in here as well, although, as I mentioned, there are many diets out there that do have higher fat content. But also, because fat is more calories per gram, some do want to decrease total fat to lower total calories in their diet. So this is also a general recommendation from the dietary guidelines. Okay, so when we talk about improving the nutrient composition of animal foods, one major argument that comes up a lot is that other foods can provide a better nutrient profile than, say, beef, milk, chicken, eggs, or pork. For example, salmon contains very low saturated fat and very high omega-3 content compared to beef, as an example. So many people argue that because these other food products may contain better nutrient content and have a lot more of these healthier nutrients, why should we bother changing animal products? And that is an argument I hear excuse me, a lot. And I think it's a really important, this slide is very important that people understand that there are many reasons why these alternative food options are not chosen, and we can't just dismiss animal products. So for instance, while salmon may have a really high omega-3 content, which is a good fat, Americans might not choose this product, the salmon, because of many reasons. For instance, cost, food access and availability, and taste, or many other reasons that aren't even listed here. And it's also important that these animal products provide value as versatile sources of nutrients. So to tell people to just change their diet simply ignores the potential benefits of these foods. So what we can do, though, is we can change these products to be more nutritious, because people, for one, love these animal food products, and it's much easier also to have them just be more nutritious than to try to convince people to change their diet when there are reasons why they haven't changed their diet in the first place. And also, these foods just provide many nutrients for you as well. So to give you an example about why these foods are so important is that meat, poultry, dairy, and eggs also make up about 30% of the U.S. daily caloric intake and over 40% of the U.S. fat intake. So if you think about that, if you change these products to make them more nutritious, and for instance, you make them have healthier fats, these products take over or are 40% of the U.S. fat intake. So if you just make a little bit of a change to make them healthier fats, that's a big change for the average American consumer. So I think this slide is really important to note that while many people argue that other non-animal related food products may have a more preferred nutrient profile, advocating for the population to decrease the consumption of animal products ignores the values of these foods as high quality nutrients. So I think this slide is really important to note, as this is an argument that comes up a lot. So our goal is to maximize the nutritional quality of food animals in the best way we can possible. And as I'll show in the future slides, pasture-raised animals can help make these animal products much more nutritious. Okay, and then along with that, previous slide, I think this slide is very important to know as well. And I know this is kind of a lot of background information as well, but I think it's really important to understand some of the arguments that are made, and then also some of the science behind why pasture-raised animals are more nutritious. And so that's what this slide shows, is more of the science behind why. So what you can see in this graph, I have a graph on the right side of the slide where it has wheat first, and then the concentrate, which is just a mixture of grains, and then also pasture grass on the right. And what you can see is that forages, including which are edible plants, edible parts of plants other than grain, which includes pasture and grass, are good sources of omega-3, the green bar here, whereas grains, such as corn and wheat, are mainly omega-6 with a very small amount of omega-3. And so this just shows you want green bar as high as possible and the red bar lower to have more omega-3 content in the feed. And so you can see grass itself has a lot more omega-3, and you can see some of the grains have a lot more omega-6. And so you can just see from this graph right here that the pasture and grass is much more nutritious. You want more of that omega-3. And of course, there can be variation in the nutritional quality of animal feed due to the maturity and variety, but it's important to note that these trends do hold true for other grains as well, not just wheat. So you have just an improved nutrient content in the feed that the animal is eating when you give them grass or pasture. And also there are other factors that can come into play here as well. But the main thing to note here is that the consumption of pasture has more of the good fats, and therefore it will influence the composition of the fat in the animal tissue that we eat, especially the levels of omega-3 fatty acids, which are considered good fats. So, and it's not just fat. Like pasture grass has more antioxidants, which are good for you as well. They're just more nutritious overall. So they're higher quality for the animal, which means higher quality, more nutritious food products that we consume. And so this slide goes over a little bit how we just talked about that pasture-raised animals or humanely raised animals are provided a much higher quality feed. And so this is because they have more pasture and less grain through access to the outdoors compared to animals raised conventionally. And as we discussed, this will lead to an improved nutrient composition in the food product. And I also talked about organic production. And so with organic production, these animals have 100% organic feed and access to the outdoors. And the outdoor access is what generally provides increased intake of forage and pasture in the diet. And some animals that we talked about, like beef and dairy, are required to have a certain percentage of diet come from pasture. And so studies suggest that organic production of these animals, because they have outdoor access or also pasture included in the diet for beef and dairy cows, that's the main reason why organic animals or organic foods are more nutritious, is because the animals have more access to pasture in their diet. And I'll go over that a little bit more here shortly. And so we'll start diving into each animal now. We'll talk about beef first, then dairy, then broiler chickens, laying hens, and swine. And we're going to be looking at conventionally raised animals versus more humanely raised animals, i.e. pasture-raised animals in this literature review. But first, also, this slide gives a little bit introduction about why the foods we eat are so important for our health. This is more of a nutrition 101 type of slide. And what you can see here is that I have 7 different things listed on why foods we eat are so important for our health. I'll go through them briefly, but this slide is really meant also for your records, where you can go back and look at this later, about why we want some of these nutrients to really make us more healthy. So I'll just briefly touch through them. So first, on the left side, we have heart health. So we talked about good fats, eating more good fats like omega-3, and avoiding more harmful bad fats. So omega-3 is a good fat. It's been shown to promote heart health. It can potentially treat heart disease and stroke, or prevent and treat heart disease and stroke, and reduce blood pressure, raise good cholesterol, and there's many other health benefits, such as reducing your risk of dementia. The next one in yellow below is obesity and disease. And this shows that we want to have a lower ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 ratio to really reduce inflammation, and an increase in this ratio really has shown to increase risk for obesity, cardiovascular disease, and other diseases as well. Next, blue below is bone health. So vitamin D is tied to bone health by, it's really needed for calcium and phosphorus metabolism to help build bones, keep your bones from becoming brittle. And it's also, vitamin D is one of the vitamins that's really focused in the nutrition field today, because it's one that actually most Americans are deficient in. And you can either get it through sunlight or you can get it through dietary sources. But there are very few foods that contain vitamin D. But one of them is eggs. And so it's really important to make sure vitamin D content in eggs is as high as possible. And then if we go to the right side, we've got anti-carcinogenic properties. So some natural trans fats that we mentioned that are in ruminants, such as conjugated nucleic acid, has been shown to have some health benefits, such as lowering the risk of various diseases, including type 2 and cancer. And the next red is blood cholesterol. You can see LDL cholesterol is the main source of cholesterol buildup. That's what sometimes you'll hear as bad cholesterol. HDL cholesterol is a good cholesterol. And what we've been able to see is that some saturated fats raise cholesterol, whereas others have no impact. I sort of touched on this a little bit before, but it's generally recommended to replace saturated fats with good fats known as PUFAs. And then oxygen in the blood is below that, and that's iron is needed for blood production. And iron is found in red blood cells called hemoglobin. That can be found in your blood and in muscle cells. And without enough dietary oxygen, you'll hear of the term anemia, and you can't make enough healthy oxygen-carrying red blood cells. So you want enough dietary iron in your diet or through your food. And then last is antioxidants. So antioxidants can help prevent or delay some damages of your cells. And the body really relies on antioxidants in the diet. So it's really important to get good amounts of antioxidants through your food. Some vitamins, like a vitamin E and beta carotene, are known antioxidants. And then there are other nutrients as well, such as carotenoids and polyphenols, that can act as antioxidants and to help prevent, many different things such as cardiovascular disease, cancer, and osteoporosis. So essentially, these are some of the things that I'll talk about in these next few slides. Really, you can see there's a clear link between good nutrition and reduced risk of diseases such as type 2, diabetes, and heart disease. So with all of that background, let's dive into the study results. And I have each slide. I see that it's 3:45 already, so I'll really hit the highlights. And I have basically one slide for each animal listed here. And each slide is kind of summarizes all of the study results that I have gone through. But as I mentioned, all the studies are referenced on each slide, so you can go through and really look at the details if you want. But what we have seen, for instance, for beef, if we go through the right side on this slide, so starting at heart health and going down to antioxidants, what we've seen is that beef cattle that's raised more humanely on pasture have been found to have much higher omega-3 fats, and these are the good fats. And then for each thing, I also list the health benefit associated that's tied with, for instance, having more omega-3 in the final beef product. So for instance, the next sentence says, these fats have been shown to potentially reduce heart disease. So it helps to tie why omega-3 fats are needed to help be more healthy or more nutritious. So for beef, if you raise them more on grass, they've been shown to have more omega-3 fats, healthy fats. If we go down, you can see that they have more conjugated linoleic acid, which is a natural trans fat. And conjugated linoleic acid has been shown to reduce cancer risk. Blood cholesterol is next. So beef raised more humanely, more on pasture, have been found to have more improved saturated fatty acid profile. So less saturated fat that raises your blood cholesterol, which is very beneficial in reducing the risk of heart disease and stroke. Next is obesity. You can see beef cattle raised more humanely have been found to have lower omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and a lower ratio, as we just talked about, has been shown to reduce the risk of obesity. And then last, we have here beef cattle raised more humanely have been found to have more vitamin E and beta-carotene and higher glutathione antioxidants as well. And these antioxidants reduce the risk of some common chronic diseases such as heart disease and cancer. So what you can see in the green box below is that the literature really supports to date that beef cattle raised more humanely with a diet that consists of more pasture and grass results in an improved nutrient quality of the beef product. And one interesting thing is that the studies have also shown that when you just switch from grain to grass, the nutrient changes, these positive changes I just mentioned, occur in just 30 to 60 days. So you can see changes start happening that quickly. So you can, the thing I do want to talk about though here is that changes start happening that quickly, but it won't be as pronounced. So we've seen that, for instance, you'll get more omega-3 in just 30 days on grass, but the longer they're on the grass, the more nutritious the product will be. But changes do start happening fairly quickly. And then I've talked about organic production, and we've talked a lot about how beef cattle are required to have pasture in their diet. So all the studies have shown too that organic beef is more nutritious, and that's primarily due to the improved quality of the diet from more pasture instead of grain. So that is really the snapshot of the improved nutrient profile for beef products that are raised more on pasture versus conventional grain. And I don't give the percentages. So for instance, I don't give 50% increase in omega-3, and that's because the studies vary so much on the percent increase. But what I do have here is the consistent results shown in all the studies to date. And that's really summarized here that we just went over. So the studies are overwhelmingly true that we get more nutritious quality beef if raised on pasture. So practical implications of this, I was also talking earlier about how, for instance, salmon would have a lot more omega-3 in the product than beef. And while that is true, we already talked about how animal products such as beef is really high up in the American diet to date. That it really matters that people get an increasing amount of omega-3 in their beef. So this slide just shows that from about 3.5 ounces of steak, you would get about 32 milligrams of omega-3 in a grain-fed steak, but you would get about 84 milligrams of omega-3 in grass-fed steak. So that's a pretty significant difference that it would be very substantial over the long run if people are eating grain or grass-fed versus grain-fed beef. This is just a practical implication to kind of give you the math behind it. And then talking about dairy, actually has all the exact same benefits as beef. So the dairy cows, all the studies for these two ruminant animals were exactly the same. So the exact same health benefits. So dairy have more omega-3 fats. They have more conjugated linoleic acid, which is a natural trans fat. They have more beneficial saturated fat content profile. They have a lower omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and they have more vitamin E and beta-carotene antioxidants. So again, overall, the literature supports that an increase in pasture and grass in the diet improves the nutrient quality of the dairy products. And again, studies have shown that this positive nutrient change can occur in just 1 month when switching from grain to grass. Again, the longer you can be on grass, the more nutritious the product, but you can get some of those benefits in just a short time. And as we'll see on every single slide, organic is also consistent, and that's primarily, organic is more nutritious, and that's primarily because of the improved quality of the feed from pasture instead of grain. I'll try to wrap up these last 3 slides. Here's nutrients in chicken meat. So with chicken, we've seen consistently in the studies that they have more omega-3 fats, they have an increase in iron content, and they have a lower omega-6 to omega-3 ratio and more antioxidants. So again, consistent. The diet with more pasture grass results in improved quality, and again, consistent with organic. Organic chicken is more nutritious as well, mainly due to the pasture. And eggs have omega-3 increase amounts in the final product. Hens that have been raised more humanely have a lower omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in the final egg product. This is really significant. They have an increased vitamin D content, and I mentioned before, vitamin D is one that's really most Americans are deficient in. So eggs have an increase to vitamin D content if the hens were raised more humanely. So that is a very good point to make, that vitamin D can increase significantly for hens that are raised outdoors on grass. And then antioxidants, hens that are raised more humanely have more antioxidants and carotenoids as well in the final eggs. So there are many benefits for humanely raised laying hens. Again, we've seen that a diet with more pasture improves the quality of the eggs. And again, organic laying hens also see the exact same trend. And then the last animal is for swine. So here we've got information on pork. You can see more omega-3 fats, an increased amount in iron in the final pork, a lower omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, and also more antioxidants such as vitamin E and polyphenol antioxidants. And so also what we've seen in the studies is that this change can occur in just 40 days for pigs. But again, the longer they're on pasture, the more nutritious the product will be. And just as all the other animals have shown, organic pork is also, or organic production of swine also gives more nutritious product because there's more pasture instead of grain. All right, so that is really the summary, and I gave a lot of background about why these nutritional changes happen, because the feed that you're giving the animals is more nutritious. The pasture you're giving them is more nutritious, and that ends up in our final product that we consume. So it really, the saying, you are what you eat. I kept thinking that when I was going through all the literature. So these animals are more nutritious because they're eating more nutritious feed when they're eating pasture grass. So I really hope that I was able to show that. And as I mentioned, you can have all the references are listed, so you can go through the studies if you're interested. But we've really shown today is that higher quality feed in the diets of beef cattle, dairy cows, broiler chickens, laying hens, and swine result in a more nutritious beef, dairy, meat, egg, and pork product. And these nutritional improvements are observed for animals that are raised more humanely on pasture and also in the organic production of these animals. I do have a bullet point here that you could potentially make some nutrient and health claims. I have a link here if you're interested in reading more about that. But really, the main thing to remember is that we want to educate consumers to shop more humanely because for many reasons, but one of which that I covered today is that they can help provide nutritional benefits to you and your family. And I believe that was my last slide.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Collette. This is Larissa again for all of you that just joined. Thank you for that fantastic presentation. We do have a couple of minutes to take a few questions. So if you'd like to type into that chat bar on the left, submit a question, I will then read some of these out loud for Collette. So going back to a couple that we received earlier, let's see. There's a question, Collette, that this may not be relevant to what you found, but in your review of the literature, did you come across any labs that where producers can have their meat tested for nutritional profiles?
Most of the labs were done at universities, and I'm not sure for farmers also who are just interested where that would be. Yeah, because most of them were done through university labs.
Okay, yeah, that's what I found too. I'll keep an eye out for that. That's a question. That's a good question to keep on my radar. Another question is, let's see. Are there any economic studies showing it's worth it for consumers to pay more for higher quality grass-fed animal products because their cost per nutrition will actually be lower, lower health, I guess lots of different lower costs. But have you seen anything along those lines that you could make the case for why investing in grass-fed foods?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that also comes from, there's a lot more on organic economics, because a lot of people buy organic products thinking that they are more nutritious as well. So you'll see, I mean, as we all know, organic in the grocery store is generally higher priced for many reasons, but one of which people understand that there could be potential health benefits associated. So there are economic studies on, you'll probably find more on the organic side. I honestly didn't come across anyone doing this literature review. There might be some, but mostly what I found is having stuff included on nutrient labels, which you could then potentially increase price because you are also providing evidence that it's more nutritious. And I think that's also why there are a lot more about organic, because people have it on the label, so they're able to show that it's more, there might be potential nutritional benefits. But I think most of the economic studies I've come across are for organic. But as we talked about today, a lot of that, the reason why organic is more nutritious is because of that pasture. So you could kind of look at those studies and kind of extrapolate.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
Perfect. I also want to share that someone shared that Medallion Labs in Golden Valley, Minnesota might be a lab that would be accessible to producers for meat testing. Let's see. We have probably time for two or so more questions. Did you come across any research on the relative amount of trace minerals or other nutrients in humanely raised versus non-humanely raised animal foods?
Did they mention which trace minerals or just any?
Yeah, I think just overall trace. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's a lot harder to tell consistently just because of, especially with day-to-day variability and instruments and accurately measuring minerals. It was a little bit harder to see the trends. Generally speaking, even for trace minerals with really low amounts, these same trends that I showed in this presentation are true for these minerals as well. So you'll get an increase in these minerals as well, but it's a lot harder to detect. So I didn't have these in the presentation because it wasn't overwhelmingly convincing. But if you look at through the studies that I've referenced, a lot of them do include some of these trace minerals as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Another one, have you seen any studies showing benefits to humans who have eaten more pasture-raised animals, i.e. will eating these foods actually lead to healthier people? I know that's kind of a big, the big question, right? Have you seen anything kind of decisive?
Yeah, so I started to go down that road as well. And there really are very, very few studies to date. There are very few studies to date even showing organic consumption of, people who eat mainly organic foods versus people who eat conventional foods and the nutritional aspect. Sorry, you're talking about humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that
I think so.
Yeah, and there's just very few studies to date. There was one good one that did show an improvement, but of course, the conclusion was we need more long-term studies and a lot more studies as well. So it's just very limited right now. But there are some out there if you're interested. It's just very, very sparse.
All right, so maybe one or two here, more questions, and I'll try to consolidate these, but questions about if you've seen any, I guess, association between soil health and animal nutrition and or differences, different kinds of grazing management and the resulting nutritional differences. I'm not sure how kind of how these studies, how deep they were able to kind of dive into those, specifics, or if it's more of a, at this point, looking at pasture raised versus more confinement.
Yeah, so I will say that generally speaking, what I've seen is that anything that's really fresh, like versus something that's preserved or dried, has a lot more of the nutrients. And I think that's really the main thing that I've seen between or having the most nutritious grass, for instance, is to just make sure that it's really fresh versus preserved or dried. So I think, for instance, vitamin E, after you cut the grass, drops like 20% in silage and like 80% in hay over time. And there's lots of factors that influence the stability of vitamins, for instance. So like there are many things that come into play, like heat, oxygen, and moisture. But the fresher it is, the better it is. And so that's really probably the most I can speak to about that.
And I'll actually also kind of transition is that in a couple weeks we will be talking about forage chaining for your livestock and how to, make that work on your operation. If folks are interested in that next webinar, it's coming up on May 30th. So that's a kind of a nice continuation. I know that we didn't get to everyone's question this afternoon, so I will be, we will follow up with you after the fact and definitely provide you with, this information and hopefully be able to answer your questions. I do have just a couple of housekeeping items before we sign off. So immediately following this webinar, just another minute or two, you're going to be asked to complete a very brief survey. And we would really appreciate it if you could take a minute to tell us about your experience today, including if you have ideas for materials that might be useful to communicate this topic with, either for you personally or with your customers. I know that's been something that came up a bunch in the comments in the question area about what kind of materials are there available. And so we do intend to develop something that would be useful to farmers in our network. So just give us some ideas about how you might use something like that. And yeah, also, as I mentioned, a recording of this webinar and the slides will be available. In fact, I posted about the slides in the chat bar, but I'll also email that link out to you. Everything will be archived on our website, and you should look for an email from me later today or first thing tomorrow. Collette, do you have any other parting thoughts before I close this webinar?
I don't think so. Just thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to share all these results, and I think the evidence to date is very convincing. So I hope everyone found it very useful. And yep, there are all the references.
They keep going for a couple more slides, so they're after the last slide of the actual presentation. Yes, thank you so much, Collette, for your fantastic presentation and really breaking all this information down for us, taking the time for the questions. I'd also like to thank all of our audience members for your attention and your interest on this topic, and I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of the afternoon. Goodbye for now.